Welcome to another episode of The Quantum State. So, quantum computing is evolving fast, and today we're diving into one of the promising approaches out there, one that integrates silicon spin qubits and photonics for scalable, fault-tolerant quantum computing. Joining us is Dr. Paul Terry, CEO of Photonic. Paul has a deep background in high-performance computing, networking, and IP services, and has led multiple billion-dollar companies across these industries. And now he's bringing that expertise into quantum computing to make scalable, fault-tolerant quantum systems a reality. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so we're very excited to talk to you. At the beginning, I really want to dive deep into your background and that entrepreneurial journey. So you worked across these fields in high performance computing, networking, and IP services. What drew you to quantum computing?
I started my career as a professor a million years ago, doing, of all things, AI. So my PhD is in AI. And then AI wasn't going very far in 1984. So I moved into performance computing, SIMD and MIMD machines, designing a lot of the fault tolerant large scale computers. And then I left and joined and joined a company to do networking. These were the days when there wasn't any networking. We didn't have networks back in the day. There were just RS-232 connections to DEC faxes. And I remember back in the day, there were 12 networks, and 11 were private and one was a public network. And the public network wasn't very good, and eventually got really good and became the internet. So we spent a lot of time there sort of making all the wide area networks for the world. So I moved from computing to communications to make all the wide area networks for North America, most of Europe, and the UK. And the reason I mention it is because having spent 20 years in networking, networking is all about scale. And so the question you always ask when you're making networks is, how do you make something that's scalable? And the first kind of point I would make is something that's scalable is something where the marginal cost of adding one more thing is zero. So if the marginal cost of adding one thing is zero, then things are scalable. If it's not zero, if it's the same as the last thing or more expensive than the last thing that you added, it can become big and expensive. And so that's the definition of scale. So I spent 20 years making hundreds of thousands of nodes in networking. And we then applied, and this will be relevant, I promise, to quantum in a second. We applied networking to revolutionize the world of supercomputing. Supercomputing hadn't been revolutionized in 20 odd years. And so what we did was we took off-the-shelf processors and networked them together to create large-scale supercomputing networks. That company got acquired ultimately by Cray, so I became the CTO of Cray. And the interesting thing about that is that when you network things together, then you have the advantage of the marginal cost of adding something is basically zero. So we would make thousands and thousands of processors in big racks and data centers back in the day. All over North America. So we made the biggest computers in the world, 30, 40,000 cores, doing 4 megawatts of power. I used to joke I was more of a HVAC engineer than a computer engineer because these things consume heat. To answer your question directly, I retired and was on a board of a hospital, and we were building a hospital. And I met Steph Simmons, who is the founder of Photonic, in 2016. I was introduced by the then Premier of the province here in British Columbia, Canada, who said, "You're an old guy sort of who built companies before. Here's a young, brilliant physicist. Could you mentor her and give us some guidance in how to make this technology that she thinks that she has realistic?" So we spoke in a coffee shop for about a year, as it turns out. And then in 2017, myself, my wife, Don Matrick, and his wife seeded the company. And we like to say this was community service for a crime we hadn't committed, because we didn't really know whether quantum would go anywhere. And I was a quantum skeptic in 2016, 2017. It would take a lot to convince me that quantum would be a commercial value proposition back then. And so then in 2017, we spoke a lot, and I asked Steph one question, which is if you can do this, and we'll get to what this is in a second, then I believe that one, quantum will be real, and two, we can make commercial quantum computers. I'm a product guy. Okay, I'm only interested in actually making things that have commercial relevance. Notwithstanding the fact that I have a lot of respect for the physicists that have come before us who have done a lot of stuff in quantum. I mean, it's quite amazing the things that have gone on. It took Steph and her team 3 years to solve that problem. She thought it would take 15 years to solve that problem, but she did it in three. So in 2019, and we'll get to what it is in a second, keep everybody hanging. And so in 2019, we were looking for a CEO that had started companies, knew about networking, knew about computing, knew about product development, raising money, running a company. Especially, I've done 6 in my career. This is my 7th. Each one of them has either been acquired or gone public. So I've been through this many, many times. It's a curse. 40 years of entrepreneurship is a curse. But there we go. It's my curse. My axe to grind. And so then we started a company in 2019 to basically commercialize the quantum that we'll be talking about in a second. Does that answer your question?
I have so many questions about the why you're a quantum skeptic and your whole commercial journey, but I'm sure we'll get to it. It's fascinating.
Yeah. So, hi, Paul. Uh, so yeah, just kind of following up on that, a lot of the leaders in quantum industry do come from physics backgrounds, and you come from this commercialization and successful scale up perspective. Can you comment about how that shapes your approach to developing Photonic as a company?
Yes, it's a really good question. My first degree was physics, in fact, so I do have an undergraduate physics, but my PhD was in electrical engineering. So to answer your question, we are making a quantum computer. If you're making a computer, we have 40 years to know how to make computers, and you have to solve the problem of compute, communication, and memory. Right? That's the golden triangle of any program you're ever going to run. You need those three things. So I was a skeptic because there's a lot of technology, a lot of modalities that don't necessarily give you all three. It's a bit like building a house. You can either have price, quality, or time. Pick two out of three. And that's how most of the quantum technologies I'd observed in the past work. They can have memory and speed, but no, or memory and compute, and no communications. That's often what people do. And so, first of all, we need all three. That's the first thing. Second one is this doesn't matter unless you come in a program that's worth something to somebody. Right, ultimately the commercialization of it, in Cray, we had 200 engineers or so working continuously in application development, doing simulations, everything from protein folding, nuclear stockpile management, sound simulations, sort of all these things. And a commonality actually in Cray is that everything in a supercomputer is basically a matrix, right? So the mathematics of supercomputing is linear algebra, which is interesting. Most everything we did was linear algebra, interestingly enough. The biggest application we used was DGEM. Do you remember DGEM? The Fortran people on the call. DGEM is the double precision matrix multiplier back in the old Fortran days, and most everything we did was matrix multipliers of some description in supercomputing. And it'll be the same in quantum, actually, as it turns out. So being application and customer focused and making a computer, for us, a computer is the same as a repeater, oddly. So for us, networking and computing actually collapse into the same thing, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a second. But it's all about computing. And so when you're in computing, it's all about quantum resource estimation. It's about how fast you can run a program. It's about latencies, as it turns out. It's about can I get a result out in a reasonable time? I used to joke in Cray that when we were selling supercomputers to weather forecasting, it's a bit bad if your forecast is 7 hours, forecasting the weather is 3 hours from now. You might as well wait for the weather. It matters how fast these things go. With a focus on delivering a product, and of course, a product is more than just running a program. There's maintainability, serviceability, service level agreements, reliability when you're making a computer. So you might imagine that my background, especially in telecoms and so forth, is to create things that never fall over. In fact, in Cray, we could actually pour water on a computer and it wouldn't fall over. It was our ability to withstand redundant and reliable service was high, especially running programs for 2 months, right? You don't want anything falling over. 3 weeks before you finish your compute. So in the company, Steph is a physicist. Steph is the mastermind. And let's be clear, Steph is a living genius in this computing and quantum area. My contribution really is making it real, making a computer, making something somebody wants to buy, and actually sort of netting out all of the noise, right? The answer to the question is you need to make a computer with between 400 and 2,000 logical qubits. That's what you need. Okay, everything else doesn't matter. And there are applications above 2,000 and there are applications below 400, but the majority of these applications will be in the 400 to 2,000 logical qubits with programs you need to run in days, not months and years. That's what we're making.
Right.
Yeah, so it's super interesting because one word you used there was reliability in the HPC space, and literally quantum computers are non-reliable right now, right? That's something that we struggle with. So just going back to that high performance computing, so do you see quantum computing as an extension of HPC, or are you thinking about it in a completely different paradigm?
I do think that high performance computing and regular service computing and quantum will be three legs of a compute stool. I do. Quantum computer is a destructive thing. You put data in there and you are destroying it when you're reading things. So it's not quite the same animal as a high performance computer. And the things that high performance computer will do actually really very well. I do think a quantum computer is much more like, and we're starting to see that, an SIMD computer. An example would be GPUs, of course, which are SIMD machines compared to HPCs, which are MIMD machines. So the quantum, certainly the ones that we're making, are much more like scalable, high-performance SIMD machines. To the extent that you can do high-performance computing on an SIMD machine, and you would say that NVIDIA is doing that, and there's certainly algorithms you can do to do that. It would be fairly similar. But in a quantum computer, you really want high compute complexity and low I/O. That's what you really want. Whereas in a lot of HPC applications, you have high I/O and lower compute complexity. If that makes sense. In a lot of high performance compute applications, it's the I/O that kills you. Right? It's gathering the data, bringing the data in. Creating file systems of petabytes or bigger. It's those are the things that are quite difficult, rather than the compute itself.
So, yeah, I mean, just something we see often in the quantum industry is, well, there's not so much of a memory of things that worked and didn't work in the past. And I wonder if you could comment on what are some lessons we can take from the development of supercomputers or HPC in general that could apply to challenges for scalability with quantum computers?
Right. So, that's a big question. So, reliability and scalability are kind of do two things there. From a reliability perspective, if you're going to offer services on these computers on the network and people are going to consume and they're going to pay you money for it, these things can't fall over. And so when we see a lot of technologies in quantum which are designed for a lab, not a data center, then you have to ask the question, how reliable are them? Cryostats, for example. If you need a cryostat operating at 15 millikelvin for a long period of time, and the moment it doesn't, then you don't have anything in service anymore. That's a problem for revenue. You're not going to generate revenue from that computer. That's the first thing. Second one, from a scalability point of view, it really comes down to back to the question of, can you add one more qubit at a zero marginal cost, right, in the limit? And that's what you have to answer. If the system just gets more complicated as it gets bigger, and most systems do, by the way, it's actually quite a difficult thing to make a system get simpler the bigger it gets. I'll give you an example. In the old days of the telecom networks where we had phones, remember those? We had wire phones and we used to ring people. Then the telecom industry back in the day, it was more complicated the bigger the phone network was. The revolution of the internet was the idea that I could have a router, I could plug it into a network, and the protocols would make the network grow from a graph perspective at basically zero marginal cost, give or take, right? And so the internet completely revolutionized telecoms to the extent that, sort of most telecoms goes across the internet now. So, and in fact, the irony of that is that in the internet network, we didn't have standards. Email still isn't a standard. right? We had RFCs. We had people said, well, let's try this. And anyway, I'm getting off topic, but it meant we didn't have big rooms of 40 people sort of trying to work out a telecom standard across 5 countries and so forth and so on to scale it. It meant it scaled. It scaled to the needs of the users, not to the complexity of the technology, and that's kind of where we're headed with quantum. So it really comes down to how do you scale. Now, what are you scaling is a question, right? So I have a view that quantum computing is basically, if you can boil it down to the consumption and creation of entanglement, right? That's what it's all about. You know, sort of every universal gate can be made out of an entangled network. And so the faster you can create entanglement and the more you can consume it, the better your computer is going to be. So entanglement for me is the currency of quantum computing. How good are you at entanglement? Right? Everybody keeps talking about single gate fidelities and 2-qubit gate fidelities and all this sort of stuff. The physicists have fun with that. That's okay. For me, it's all about entanglement. That's the currency of quantum. And that's what we do a lot of for us, and we'll get into the qubits in a second, but it's all about making, creating, and consuming entanglement. So then the question you ask is, well, how do you make entanglement? So the majority of technologies, and I'm in awe of the technologies, I have to say, but most of them create entanglement via proximity. So we actually make something next to something, and we collapse the wave function by having some sort of proximity measure. We want them closer, but then from a noise point of view, we want them further away. And so we have this tension between closeness and sparseness. Okay. So if you're not going to make them next to each other, which is where all the surface code type stuff comes from, then your next job is to, hey, can I take two things that are far away and then bring them together and then create essentially collapse wave function or a wave function and then take them apart. So we have the ideas of moving things to create quantum entanglement. The thing that Steph identified very early on in 2016 was, hey, we could actually entangle two quantum objects that have never met each other. Okay, and the way you do that is that you get those quantum objects to emit photons, which are entangled with the spins of the electrons they leave behind, and then you interfere the photons. When you do that, then the entanglement projects to the spins of the electrons that actually generated the photon. Now, that's an interesting idea, which is an idea that's been around for 20 plus years. We didn't invent it. It's an idea that won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2022, because when I say this to people, they go, that's not possible. I go, well, don't tell me, go tell the Nobel Prize people that it's not possible. I'm not a Nobel Prize winner. But then now you can entangle two things at the speed of light that have never met each other. Okay, so now you free yourself of the proximity-based problems that you had. All the noise problems, all the noise near interface problems, all these things that very clever people are trying very hard. It's great not to have to solve a problem. Okay, so that's one thing I'll take away from HPC is that the problems you don't have to solve are some of the good problems because then you can get on with it, right? So imagine this. I'm giving you a job here, which is go design something which has got a qubit that can be far away from all noise sources, can be in a quiet environment, just needs an optical signal out. And then if we interfere the optical signals together, we can create entanglement. And since quantum computing is a consumption of that entanglement, then we can run a quantum computer. The thing that I mentioned to Steph in 2017 is if you can make that photon that you issue a telecom photon, i.e. a photon that is compatible with data center fiber and with telecom fiber, now these two qubits can be on different sides of the planet and you can interfere them, which is what we do. So it took 3 years to create what's called a T-center, which we'll talk about in a second, which had the property of, when you stimulate it, it issues a telecom photon. Okay, and then we interfere the telecom photons to create entanglement. That's kind of what we do. What that means is that our architecture is super simple. It's a qubit on the end of an optical fiber. That's what it is. So if you want two, you have two qubits on two optical fibers wherever you want to put them. If you want 1,000, you put 1,000 qubits on the end of optical fibers. Right? Which is incidentally how we made supercomputers. Right? So, basically putting processors on the end of, in that case, high-speed custom network links. So I'm off on a tangent again.
No, it's really interesting, and it makes sense, right? So my background was in neutral atom quantum memories, and I was doing telecom wavelength work back then. And sometimes you joke, it's like telecom is just, the quantum chip is telecom just over a very small distance. So it's interesting to talk about all this and bring it together. So it really makes sense that your approach would integrate this silicon spin qubit and the telecom photons. So can you also explain those two? Kind of explain, like I'm five, what each of those are, and go a little bit more about why this is such a breakthrough. Like I love the graph. Like the graph makes a lot of sense, right? When you talk about a network or a telecom network, the nodes and the communications makes a lot of sense. But really dive deep into why this also will accelerate the computing side of it.
Right. So, so the invention that Steph created, and she was a silicon spin person before she came to Canada, and she went to Simon Fraser University, and they allow all of their professors to have their own IP. So there's no IP clawback, which is something all universities could learn, to be honest. And so what she did was, if you take a sugar cube of silicon atoms, a pure silicon atom, then this is a naturally forming substance in the world. If you fly that silicon cube into space, what they found in the 70s and the 80s is that cosmic radiation would knock out the center silicon atoms and replace them with all sorts of atoms from the solar radiation. And so they became known as defects. And so there's this whole literature for 25 years of silicon defects related to flying basically silicon chips into space. And it causes problems, of course, in running computers in space when you get outside the magnetic field. Take that one step further, Steph looked at those defects and found that, hey, in one what we call a T center, and there's actually a family of these centers. So think of it as a sugar cube with silicon atoms on the outside, and the inside 2 carbon and a hydrogen atom, which are naturally forming, so you can make these. There are 4, count them, 4 qubits. There's a free electron trapped in this sugar cube. And then each of the carbon nuclei spin, and the hydrogen is a spin. So there are 4 qubits in this kind of atomic structure. This structure is about half a nanometer cube. So it's not very big. It's a lot smaller than a transistor, if you think about how that is. So now the reason it took 3 or 4 years is we tried hundreds of different atoms in the center of this cube, and the carbon one was the one that gave us the free electron that would go up and down an energy level and issue the photon at telecom wavelength, in a nutshell, right? Bit of high school physics, right? So people who Steph would go into lots of details about the Hamiltonians of all these things, but that's essentially what happens. So. And so then you have to control it, and you control it with an electric field and magnetic field, and then you have basically an optical fiber going to each one of these T centers. Now, with 4 qubits, we can do swaps, for example, inside the T center, so we have memory. The electron spin itself, of course, we can control in very normal spin ways. And then when we excite the electron up and down, we issue a photon, which is entangled with the spin of the electron it leaves behind. So this is how we can create distributed entanglement. And that's the building block of everything we do. And then the nice thing is you want to put one of these things in the middle of a silicon chip, far away from interfaces, far away from everything. In fact, the further away it is from everything, the better, because its only interaction is photonically. So that's the architecture that we use. And so we have compute, communication, and memory in one T center, if that makes any sense. So that forms the basic building block, if you like. The transistor, I think of it as a transistor of a new generation of quantum. Nice thing is that you can make those chips. We use standard silicon manufacturing techniques. There's nothing complicated about how we make them. And then when the photon comes up, we use standard telecom photonic switches. In fact, when we did the first computer we set up, we did everything off the shelf. We literally plugged these into telecom switches. Can you believe this? Okay. So now you have this architecture where you've got all of these qubits feeding switches. Now you have an operating system sitting on top of this, that can, and of course we have switches and detectors also built onto the chips. We have single photon detectors and fast switches. And so you can arbitrarily cross-connect T centers to other T centers. So you can, in a clock cycle, if you like, say, connect 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6, and then you can connect 1 to 7 and 8 to 9. So you have, in every clock cycle, you can arbitrarily create any topology you want to. Now, this is a rich branch of computer science, one that we worked a lot on in Cray, which is to create multidimensional toroids and so forth of microprocessors for particular application development. Okay, so and we would reconfigure it on the fly. So the operating system would reconfigure. So when you compile a program, you can figure out what needs to be connected to what, when, and how, which makes layer 1, 2, and 3 gates actually much easier to do than you might imagine, just from a technical point of view. Now, there's a more important thing that goes on here. So we're probably jumping ahead here, but in terms of error correction codes, LDPC codes are very good codes. LDPC codes are on every cell phone. Every cell phone uses LDPC codes to get signal to noise from the 5G wireless. It's a standard in the 5G wireless setup. You can take those LDPC codes and convert them to quantum LDPC codes, of which a surface code actually is a degenerate form of an LDPC code, just for fun. Okay. Now, when you do that, you now have a world of topology, a world of graph theory at your fingertips to cross-connect and interconnect things. And the mathematicians will tell you that this just gives us a degree of freedom we've not seen before. What that manifests in is error-correcting codes that don't need a lot of physical qubits. So Steph published a paper about 3 weeks ago now indicating quantum LDPC codes. Rather than needing 1,000 physical qubits to make a logical qubit, we can get away with 15. And so when you with a logical error rate of 10 to the minus 4. So when you start to be able to do that, you can, it's just one of these, you open a door into a world where things are just getting better. And back to the scalability argument, the less physical qubits I need to make a logical qubit, the more scalable this thing gets. And it turns out that LDPC codes get better the more physical qubits you have. In other words, they're more efficient as the number of physical qubits grows. Okay, back to the scale argument. I'll keep coming back to the scale argument because it's one that helps people frame what's real and what isn't. So when we're trying to get to thousands of logical qubits, think about how many physical qubits you need, and if you can reduce that, then life is better. Okay, that's what we trying to figure out. So it's all about the networking thereby to do that. Now, it also has an advantage in that now quantum networking and quantum computing is indistinguishable to us. Okay, so imagine a quantum computer in place A and a quantum computer in place B. Imagine telecom fiber between them. We could even put our computer in the middle of it and act as a repeater. So the computer is an automatic repeater, and we've already demonstrated these things. And so now you can actually create a surface, a quantum surface, if you like, of any quantum, because all the qubits care about is that another qubit somewhere in the world that's going to get connected to. And it doesn't have to be on chip or in box, in a cryostat, in a building, in a place, in a location. It could be anywhere in space.
Could you just give us, I know we can't show slides here, but could you give us a picture in words of what the architecture looks like? So, for example, people might have seen, superconducting chips where it's sort of a 2D array of superconducting qubits, or you have the ion trap quantum computer designs. You have like a network of linear, little regions of linear trap arrays, or neutral atom 2D micro lens arrays with tweezers. What does it look like?
Great question. Sorry, I take it for granted because I see that every day. Okay, so the compute chip is a silicon chip. We put that into a 2K cryostat, and then above the chip is a fiber array that physically comes down vertically onto the chip. And each one of the fibers sits above a T center. Okay. There's also pads on there to get electrical and magnetic fields in, and then that goes into a 1K cryostat, and then the optical signals and the I/O comes out. all the control electronics is in 19-inch racks. There's 3 of them, 19-inch racks, and then the optical fibers come out into switches, and then the switches can be cascaded, and that represents a unit, and you can put units together and link them together via switches. So the majority of the system is at room temperature, but the chip is held it's about 1.5, 1.6 K in the cryostat, and that represents the unit of work, if you like. And then we can put as many as we want out, connect them by switches to make an arbitrary size computer. The whole thing is about 10 square meters, if you like. It's really a cryostat with ultimately 6 19-inch racks in one enclosure that represents what you can do.
And you said you go down to 2 Kelvin?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
So we don't need millikelvin temperatures. That's not useful for us. The only reason we go down to that temperature actually is the detectors single photon detectors like temperatures like that, and that's what dominates the. So the cryostat isn't overly complicated. It's not overly expensive. The chips themselves, we actually have 2 manufacturing facilities. We make our own chips. We have one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast of North America. And then we make 4 or 5 chips a week. And in fact, we make chips on an agile cycle. So we'll make the devices, we'll put them in, we'll test them, and we'll do our material science and so forth. For fun, just as a demonstration of how much density you can get, we did put 1 million of these T-centers on a chip in 2021 just to play with it, just to see what we could do. That wasn't a functional computer. Let me be clear. You need to put detectors and switches on the chip as well. There's a surround to it, but we put 1 million on just to see, because these things are smaller than transistors, and we can put 53 billion transistors on a chip. So we often talk about a scale up and a scale out strategy for quantum. Scale up being making more logical qubits per box. Scale out making more boxes per computer. And so we have both those axes is active development. We continuously improve the number of logical qubits per system, and we improve the number of units per system that we can put out. And these things only consume about 40 kilowatts. And so for a unit there. So compared to the 4 megawatts in Cray, this is a lot easier. Trust me, heat is your enemy. It's not fun to cool 4 megawatts of power. It's just not fun. Big fans.
So one of the terms that's becoming more popular to use to describe these technologies is modules, where you think about like a certain region that can be efficiently prepared of qubits, which can interact strongly with each other, and then you can use some non-local connections to connect modules. Does that terminology work with your architecture, and how many qubits could you realistically fit in such a device?
So first of all, you guys, Stacey, you're more of a physicist than I ever was, so you can tell me I'm wrong. But the idea that you can actually put a NIC card in a quantum machine and connect quantum machines together, to me, is laughable. I mean, quantum is so. Quantum communications is so embedded, the theorem of quantum doesn't necessarily allow it. And I often worry about what people are hearing about, I can just network quantum systems together. It's not that easy. You really have to go back to square one when you do that. If it's at all possible, then your efficiency goes down, which actually leads to a very good question, which I think is what you're alluding to, is in high-performance computing, Amdahl's law dominated. Are you familiar with Amdahl's law? So Amdahl's law is the law of parallel processing. And so what it says is basically, if you can parallelize lots of things, not unsurprisingly, it's the sequential things that'll kill you in terms of getting things out. Okay, so if you can, in the limit, take a program and infinitely parallelize it, so every compute takes no time, it's getting the data to the actual machine. So Amdahl's law will dominate quantum as well, and it's amazing to me that people don't see that. Because it really matters. Well, so the things that kill you in Amdahl's law, and it's like this for every processor you ever have, is anything sequential. So I'll give you an example. If you're running a program on a microprocessor and you do a memory fetch, and that memory fetch is 200 nanoseconds, if you go into memory, that computer is not going to work very fast. So what they did was they invented caching, and so you could prefetch stuff from memory, put it in a cache. So when you wanted it for a program, it was 5 nanoseconds, not 200 nanoseconds. Okay, so this idea of prefetching basically revolutionized microprocessors. In fact, if you switch off the cache of a microprocessor, your 4 gigahertz microprocessors turn into 100 megahertz processors. They go very slow very quickly. And it's the thing that always kills you in high performance computing. Same thing is going to happen here. So where are your latencies in your system design that you need to address so that you're on the right side of Amdahl's law, so you can parallelize as much as you need to. One of them is going to be entanglement generation and the modularity. If, for example, one of the interchip is really fast, but between modules is really slow, your computer won't work, right? Yeah, because it'll be too slow. Or I shouldn't say that. It'll go as fast as the slowest horse, which is the connection between two computers. Okay, and so it's very important to make sure that when you're designing a system of computers and you have lots of modules, that you respect Amdahl's law in the things, and it'll get you in the strangest of ways. So I'd encourage the listeners to take a look at it and say, oh, okay, Amdahl's law is true then, it's going to be true in the future. Right? This computer science has not really changed in that regard. It's just that it's entanglement now, not memory fetches, that are going to be your rate limiting step.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I spent 3 years working on like a classical algorithms team, and basically our whole thing was make math faster, right? So we were doing a lot of graph theory work, and basically make the graph as wide as you can. But yeah, the bottleneck was, obviously for like summing, it's very, very simple to, spread out that calculation on instances, and then you just sum together at the end. But, one of my first projects when I joined the team was how do you do an efficient median calculation when you have a billion data points, right? All of that is really interesting when you look at it from this graph and network perspective. And I have seen actually in the last 6 months more conversations popping up about modularity. I mean, there's companies out there talking about, yes, our plan to scale is modular. There's companies popping up even creating services for the modularity. But I think when I dove into it, I only really saw, my concern there was, well, how do you even write algorithms for a modular system at that point, right? And that's the same thing. Then you have to, put things on every system, somehow connect get it together. It has to go to a new place. And there was really only one paper that even started, on that side to even start talking about how do we even rethink quantum algorithms in that end.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and we have whole teams on that now.
Mm-hmm.
So working through the exact point. It's a bit like the old days of, keep going back to the old days, don't I? Shit, actually, I'm almost 90, that's what it is. I know, I looked at it, there you go. The old days of Fortran, do you remember in Fortran, you never had pointers? And then when C came along, it gave you pointer arithmetic. And the difference there was that, hey, now I don't have to move memory around. I can just move pointers to memory around, which people now on the call will probably go, well, has that always been the case? Nope, that was a very recent thing in the mid 80s when we actually had pointer arithmetic. Same sort of things are going to happen in quantum. So you'll notice on this call, we're not talking about fidelities of a qubit and 2-qubit fidelities and those types of things. Whilst they're important, and we have them, and we could talk about them, actually the computer science is going to be important. It's running the applications on these qubits across multiple units that are modular and can be connected together. And the modularity also talks about redundancy. So when you do things properly, then if one unit in that module goes down, another one takes over. The question is, how do you do that? And we do it at the operating system level by just taking that one out of service and putting another one in service. So all we have to do is cross-connect the qubits, right? So again, we stand on the shoulders of giants. It's not because we're brilliant. It's just because when you have a philosophy of networking together qubits, you give yourself degrees of freedom you don't have otherwise.
Yeah, and even thinking about it on the practical side, right? I know we're going completely off topic, but I'm really interested. Even thinking on the level of like eventually people will have to program these systems, right? So some of the danger of manufactured qubits is the problem of, well, manufacturers, but one of the qubits is dead or the calibration is off, and you have to rewrite your code for that day or even that hour, right? To make it as efficient as possible. So it's very interesting. The benefits and costs of each are really interesting when we talk about it. And that's why it's so hard to talk about quantum. Like you said, there's so many nuances to these challenges that we have to get to.
So on that point, we often talk about logical qubits in service.
Mm-hmm.
And so our qubit is in service or it's not in service. Mm-hmm. And you can take a qubit out of service. You can calibrate a qubit. You can make another qubit. You can put that into service. Again, it comes down to the marginal cost argument, which is now at the OS layer, the OS will actually have qubits spare, ready to put into service if it needs to. You don't have to rewrite the programs to execute a program on a computer. You just have to basically configure the computer to execute the program. If a qubit dies for whatever reason, then you can rearrange it. We have this idea of services of logical qubits. Okay.
Yeah, I really like that term. That's a cool one, in service. Can you, again, I'm just imagining possibilities now, like on the fly, right? So compile an algorithm to, so not every logical qubit will have the same number of physical qubits depending on the algorithm. Is that something on your roadmap and in the
Yep.
plans?
And in the OS, we even use some AI to actually sort of move things around, change order of execution, to optimize entanglement generation. This is entanglement generation that'll be the biggest latency in a system like this. Okay, so without getting too deep into it, we have mechanisms to create entanglement continuously. Right,
Mm-hmm.
so let's keep entangling as much as we can because we know we're going to need it at some point. Okay, so again, getting into the OS, if you like, a quantum OS, which needs to handle all of those things. It's interesting that nobody'd heard of photonic up until about last year. I had a very strong view that while there's so much noise forgive the pun, in the quantum industry that I didn't want to stand on top of a hill and shout about these things until we'd done them. Just put heads down. Let's get on with it. Let's keep the faith. So it was only about November last year, I think, that we ever told anybody that we actually had qubits. And so thank you for the opportunity to tell people how it actually works in the end.
Definitely. No, it's also a very ungoogleable name. I always think it's very funny that Google itself created a programming language, Go, that's like impossible to actually like find documentation for because it's so hard to Google up. You search Photonic, you have a lot of information out there, and now you guys are rising to the top of those searches as quantum evolves.
Yeah, we're starting to make it known now what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. And so now interconnect has become a thing, scale is becoming a thing, which is good. And that's all good, right? Because we want to promote quantum companies making 400 to 2,000 logical qubits, because then we can actually sort of run the applications. And of course, the killer application of quantum is chemistry, right? So everybody's working on chemistry applications, but you need about 400 to 2,000. Again, there are applications above that, but they tend to be specialized, like Shor's algorithm stuff out.
Yeah, so along that lines, as you move from like research level to commercially viable applications, what's Photonics' plan to accelerate the timeline for useful quantum computing?
So we have customers now. We have what we call journey customers. These are people we give access to the quantum computer with, so they can talk and we can figure those out. What I'm interested in actually is when governments see these services being deployed, what they will do to regulate them. That's the question I have. I have a question about deploying the services. We're on track to do that. It's a question of whether we'll be allowed to in some particular cases. And then we have the sovereignty thing that's going on right now that causes a confusion in the force, if you like, a movement in the force.
Yeah, I want to dive a little bit into those real world applications. You kind of mentioned chemistry was something that you were saying that was something that you're really focusing on.
Right.
I believe these are going to be the first real world problems that you'll be able to solve, or are there other ones you're looking at as well?
So chemistry is the easiest one, if there is such a thing as an easy one. So I think that we're looking at of course, is that for the listeners, of course, there's skill testing question. Yeah, how many chemicals are there in the world? Do we know? 118, I think, is the last count, of which 80 are stable. So everything that we eat, everything we drink, all of biotech, all material science, all of catalysts are all some sort of combination and permutation of those 80 stable elements, give or take. Right, just a sweeping statement there. Okay, so 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 what we've been asked to do is compute chemistry, which is about 1,400 logical qubits, I think, is what our QRE says currently. I think it's going to come down. So we have teams working on that. Another interesting idea is that we've also thought long and hard about using the quantum computer for training data. for a chemistry AI. So what the internet is to ChatGPT, if you like, we could create a body of information for chemistry. Humans have not done chemistry well on computers. In Cray we tried very hard, but it becomes an n-body problem, and very quickly you run out of compute time. And so the quantum computer is going to allow us to move past that. So we have chemists on staff to run exactly those, and they're looking at the fundamental algorithms like quantum Fourier transform type things, or essentially quantum phase estimation is probably the algorithm of choice there. And we do that actually because, as you know, when you made a microprocessor, when you have applications, you find that actually you can create factories, or what quantum would call factories. You can have GPUs and CPUs and floating point units and cache things, and so the ability to create basically dedicated facilities, if you like, on a chip to do specific things that are algorithm dependent is what the next generation is. To a large extent, we've solved the kind of flat topological qubits, throw things onto it. It is interesting, sort of just for fun. Do you want a fun story? Where did modern microprocessors come from? Do you know the answer to that question? So I think the transistor was first patented in Canada in 1925. Then in 1949 or so, Bell Labs figured out that they wanted to make a hearing aid, and they wanted to make a transistor amplifier. So they made an amplifier for a hearing aid. So that happened in about 1950, 51, something like that. And then somebody had the bright idea, if I use a transistor backwards, it turns into a switch. So then I can use my kind of maths and have gates, and then I can have a processor, and then ultimately I have Facebook and Google. So the origins of Facebook and Google are actually in hearing aids. The reason I tell that story is we don't actually know quite where this is going to end up. But what we do know is if you can put things onto silicon, humans are very good at making silicon chips. I mean, it's the thing that we make. They're the smallest things we make. They're the most accurate things we make. We make them in high volumes, and we make them incredibly cheaply. We are really good at putting 50-odd billion transistors on a chip today. So I'm hopeful that the future of quantum will actually sort of benefit from 30, 40 years of silicon chip stuff, plus the 40 years of photonic interconnection stuff, which is the basis of all telecom. And so that's how we base the technology. And it works that way, actually. We can already do programs. That's the other interesting thing is as a side issue, I mentioned the creation and the consumption of entanglement. I'm not sure listeners are aware that rather than using gate-to-gate type operations, you can do all gate operations by consuming entanglement. So there are entanglement networks that you can create, which when you read and you consume it, actually sort of basically do gate operations. What that means is that you can do a gate across two machines that could be 1,000 miles apart. Right, so the gates don't have to be local anymore. So your two qubit gate fidelities are basically turns out to be how do you consume entanglement across two boxes that could be 1,000 miles apart. And of course, the entanglement takes time. The consumption takes no time. I'm sure the physicists will get all upset with me for saying that. But so entanglement is basically instantaneous. Or the consumption, the reading of it is basically instantaneous. So you can do literally distributed computers by having distributed gates on a sea of qubits anywhere in the network of qubits. And then what you do is just make every unit cheaper and cheaper. And more logical qubits per unit. So you just get relentless about making it cheaper, making it more reliable, making it more manufacturable, controlling the supply chain, and increasing the logical qubits per unit. Because the real smarts are in the operating system, and then the way you take jobs in and you distribute them onto your sea of qubits.
Just a question about chips, because you've really gave us some nice connections between lessons from classical computing and challenges for quantum. And so there's this phenomenological rule, Rent's rule, that shows up in classical computing, which is a scaling law between the number of pins or input-output on an integrated circuit and the number of logic gates or cells, and that follows a power law scaling. And do you see such a scaling rules showing up in quantum or something like it in your architecture?
Yeah, so it's a good question. In the short term, we do the very simple thing, which is we have one fiber per qubit. So our problem becomes a mechanical problem. The maximum number of qubits we can put on a chip is actually only dependent on the number of fibers that we can put on top of the chip. So, and that's kind of a brain dead way of doing it, if you like, for want of a better description. The next stage of that, of course, is to start multiplexing the photons down a fiber, and then putting a demultiplexer actually on the chip. So there's a whole world there actually of innovation that can be done to take, sort of 2,000 or so physical qubits on the chip up to 3, 4, and 500,000 qubits on the chip. I don't think we've run into any scaling laws yet. This is purely practical, pragmatic multiplexing and essentially cryo CMOS. So we're not up to the 50 odd billion gates on a chip or transistors on a chip in quantum here. If we get a million or so T centers on a chip, we'll probably be happy. The T centers, of course, are quite small. It's the stuff around them that's bigger. There's opportunity here for multi-chip solutions actually. So there's a whole innovation around that. But remember, all you got to do is actually get a fiber or get a photon out of a T center, which actually goes through a waveguide. So we have whole teams just working on continuously improving. I don't see, to answer your question, I don't see a power law in the short term. Maybe there will be one in the long term, and if there is one, that just means that the scale up gets limited, but we still have the scale out.
Yeah, so now I want to dive in a little bit about these future predictions. It's been awesome to get into the technology. And you kind of went on this before. You're a skeptic, and there's a lot of hype in the field in quantum computing. So, what's the biggest misconception that people have about quantum computing or the timeline or the technology?
So I certainly was a skeptic. I live in Vancouver, so I know the companies here very well. In BC in Canada, which is kind of the home of quantum. And I think you alluded to it at the beginning, which is if you're going to have a computer that you want to put into service, it has to work. It has to have some reliability and has to sort of deliver things. And if you have half-lives of qubits, which isn't very big, then you're very, very limited. So I remember when we started in 2019, 2020, and Steph had the vision here of logical qubits and error correction. I remember watching people on stage saying, well, quantum is 10 years away, and it's always 10 years away. And it's always 10 years away because we lived in this NISQ era for a long time. And it was a point where, you know better than I, where I have 52 qubits, but that's nothing. I have 53. Screw you, I've got 56, I've got 58. It was about the number of qubits. Okay, so that's where it started, is the number of qubits. So now NISQ is, I think, the phase one of quantum is over. I would call NISQ to phase one, and we're in phase two, which is small numbers of logical qubits, which of course has gotten everybody excited again because, oh, hey, maybe we're going to have qubits that actually last long enough to do something useful, which is fair. And so people are making whatever 8, 10, 12, 30 logical qubits, which is great. And I applaud them for doing that. We always started with the view that if we don't get to a couple of thousand logical qubits per system, then we're not trying hard enough. And so that's the goal there. And so we're very focused on that. And so having small objects that are manufactured on silicon, etc., leads to that. And then it was error correction. So I think that looking at the error correction, and by the way, whilst we have the codes now and we can do the error correction and we can get those numbers for logical qubits, I don't think it's over yet. This is just the start of, surface codes had, 20 years of academics. And one of the reasons we released the paper is to show the academics, hey, go crazy, go find better error correction codes because they're out there and they're out there for very large numbers of physical qubits. So smart people doing smart things, it's not going to take people very long once they've walked through that door to kind of figure out better and better and better and better codes, and that just helps us as far as I can make out. That's a question. I don't think it's 10 years anymore. I think it's 2 years or less. And if I'm wrong by what, a year? We're not far out. And this is less than a PhD time. The increment, is not high at the moment, and it's just going to get faster and faster. So then I think people turn on to what I think of as more interesting things, which is QRE, and how how to properly use this kind of compute resource, given it's different from HPC because it's a destructive resource.
So you mentioned 2027, which is really coming up soon. To
Tell me about it. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned Shor's algorithm, and going back to the conversation about parallelism, Shor's algorithm is actually a very deep circuit, as we refer to it in the quantum space, right? Because you have to do a lot of operations in a row. And so even though Shor's algorithm is kind of later on, and to me, sometimes it's one of the most boring things to talk about because it is destructive, right? It's not creating as much value as chemistry and other applications. The US government is focusing pretty deeply on the idea that quantum computers are going to be coming soon. They are going to be able to run Shor's algorithm. Seeing right now in the government, if you are a vendor, they're asking you about PQC, post quantum cryptography. Hey, what's your plan for implementing it? So how do you see that government adoption compared to that private sector right now?
So I think that, and Steph, in fact, spoke to the Parliament of Canada on this very point, which people can find on the web. So first of all, the threat of a quantum computer breaking RSA and equivalent is real. Let's just be super clear. It's going to happen. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And of course, all security is layered security. So PQC is probably good for the lower layers of security, and it's probably a given for kind of a t equals 0. So I'm not surprised that governments have saying, hey, you know what, we've relied on RSA and equivalent for the last 40 years. Let's make sure that we now have some crypto, that's the word they use. We can move around a lot on the crypto, and PQC is one of them. Of course, everybody's concerned that certain governments may have broken it already, and that's a problem. But when we get into the layer higher, then you need to quantum secure links. And the thing about quantum securing links is that if you have point-to-point security on links and you put quantum, which you can buy today, of course, it doesn't scale because you need n squared. It's an order n squared problem to have link-to-link connections from everybody, right? So that's a problem. And we've solved that actually by, we can use one of our quantum computers, we can actually project entanglement into our computer and we can cross-connect. And so we can have an order n security at the physical layer with just by linking T centers together. We're not doing anything complicated in compute, just by basically cross-connecting and basically interfering photons. So for example, we could deploy in a data center a unit that would actually sort of get connected to each one of the servers you want, and it would give you keys every second, and it would give you a guaranteed quantum security on the link layer. We could do that now, as it turns out. So I do think that's going to come in. It's a byproduct of what we do, right? Because of the way our networks work. But it appears to become increasingly important to do that, so that interbank lending links don't get compromised and national security links don't get compromised. You might imagine there's a lot of those. I spent 20 years in networking. We spend a lot of time on those links. But again, that's a problem you can solve again by taking away the n squared problem of point to point and have point to multi-point links, and then you can actually solve that problem. In fact, we already send stuff through a telecom network through a carrier switch to demonstrate this.
Yeah, Gavin is the king here of the crypto betting markets on security, and there's some interesting ones you dove into on the quantum security side. So it's definitely a big topic of conversation.
It really is. It's not something we spend a lot of time on, honestly, but it's something that people are very interested in. I mean, we have people on staff. We have the leading QKD experts on staff actually, doing these things at the moment. There's so much to do. Yeah, we have to get on with it. Have to make this computer.
There's a ton to do in the field, and I still have so many more questions about every aspect of this technology, but this has been an incredible discussion. We covered the spin photon, quantum computing, error correction. I really want to dive deep into cryogenic side as well and the future of the quantum industry. So thanks for sharing your insights with us. And what is next for you guys, or what can you share? Maybe a little bit, a couple of tidbits about what you're working on that we'll see before 2027, and where can we find more information about Photonic?
Yeah, so the Photonic website, of course, is a good place to go. We continue to innovate in the error correction area. We continue to drive up the number of physical and logical qubits that we are deploying. That's kind of the name of the game. And we'll be increasingly in the next several months starting to ramp up the computer science, if you like, awareness of what it means to run a program as a service on a quantum computer.
Definitely. So that's really exciting. So thank you so much, Paul, for coming on the Quantum State, and Gavin for co-hosting with me. So to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode. If you are watching on YouTube, those links will be in the description below. And stay tuned for more deep dives into quantum innovation. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.